This is Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. We're here today in the home of one of Georgia's best-known and widely appreciated public servants, former state senator and public service commissioner Bobby Rowan. Bobby, we're in your home. It's a very beautiful home, and understand it has some history.
Well, it's an old house. It does have some history. Two men treasured it before I owned it, and they lived from the time they acquired it until their death. I hope I can do the same thing. The hardwood will last longer than me, though, I assure you so. But this house was built in 1932 by a sawmiller from Alapaha, Georgia, which is 7 miles away. And he selected heart pine lumber from his sawmill, and he built the house, and he lived, raised his family until 1958 when he passed away. Lewis Barnes, a native Enigmian, he bought the house from him and moved it 3 miles out of Enigma on the Turner Church Road. And he lived in it 40 years to 1998. And we lived next door in the brick house down here. Barbara really enjoyed restoring old houses and things. I liked the house because it was just like the one I was raised in, where my parents had 9 children. I was the middle one. And our house was almost a duplicate of this one. And so it was an easy house. A hall and bedrooms on one side, and kitchen and whatever on the other. And so it suited me too. It's a pleasant house to live in. So we bought it, we moved it here again. It's been now moved twice, and started redoing it. On the outside, even though the lumber at that point was some 70 years old, we only replaced 4 boards on the whole house. And we kept all of the old woodwork, and we opened it up a little bit. And the thing that we agreed on that I really wanted was that there's no paint on this house inside or out. It's not white. I only bought one kind of paint, that's white. So we live in the White House in Enigma. We got a front porch and some rockers you can rock on, and I hope to spend the last phase of my life sitting out there thinking about meeting people like the two of you and reminiscing about the great ones of Georgia, from Zell Miller to Herman Talmadge to Celestine Sibley. Celestine was a great friend of mine, and she was an admirer of this house. Come here several times on her way to Willacoochee, where she had ancestry, but she was a national treasure. She come by here, and she was willing to take a glass of sweet iced tea, and we enjoyed it. But anyway, that's the house, and we also put up a white fence so people know we're serious about white.
Well, we're anxious to share with you some of your experiences and memories of Georgia politics, beginning with your election to the Georgia Senate in 1962 at the age of 26. But before we do that, let's talk for a minute about Bobby Rowan growing up in Enigma, Georgia.
Well, I really came from a huge Rowan family. My great-grandfather was William Berry Rowan, that moved to this county in 1846. He had run away from North Carolina at 14 and moved to the county in 46. And then in 1850, he moved to this county and built a house. And the house burned in 1878, and he built a second house. And, you know, it was a poor working man's house. And actually, my son and I still have that house built in 1878. And one day we might restore it. But it's got wide boards that he hand sawed, and a pack house that's a little older than the house itself. I was the middle of 9 children. And 9 children was not unusual because my daddy, he was called J. Alvin Rowan, was all double named. And he was also the middle of 9 living children. There's more than that of them, but there's 9 lived to be old enough to join service or leave home. And then his name was James Henry Rowan, and he lived on the same land that I was raised on. And his daddy, as I said, was William Berry. William Berry had 9 children. So we had 3 generations of 9 children born on the same 2-acre square of land in Barron County. I married a girl from Enigma and moved up here and started teaching school and farming. But when I was at the University of Georgia, the passion growing up was Mom and Daddy, who didn't have much opportunities for education, but they had more intelligence than all 9 children. They wanted us to go to school, encouraged us to get an education, particularly the girls. There's 4 girls and 5 boys. And my daddy was passionate about the girls. And this conversation was many times around the kitchen table. You know, I've got it in the book about the teachings of my father at the table. We had pleasant conversations at night, long conversations. Mother was a great cook on an old wood stove and a long bench, and as more children would come along, the knee baby would slide down and high chair would be replaced. And when you went on around, you kept sliding around, and you got close to Daddy, who always sat at the head of the table. Conversations would be, "What you gonna do now, son?" Because we knew, you know, with them children coming, somebody had to leave. They encouraged us to go to college and helped us. Daddy would always say, "Now, I'm gonna help you boys, but I'm gonna send you girls. I want you girls to get education because you might marry somebody that dies, have to raise children. You might marry somebody that's sorry. You have to run him off. Still got to raise children." And so he, and anyway, finally, between the GI Bill and one of us helping the other one, all 9 of us did, in fact, finish from the University of Georgia system and various things. But while I was there, because I had a sister in school at the same time, and I was working in the mess hall and doing different things, I found out there's a job on campus called campus leader. And if you got elected to that, you had free room and board and certain other fringes and could sell a little stuff and whatever. So I ran for it. It might have been the hardest race I ever ran. I needed it and got elected. Had a lot of friends on Ag Hill at that time. My opponent was a law student. It was and not a bad feller, except I didn't say that until after I defeated him. But I got Ag Hill all revved up in the Ag Hill Council. There's more poor farm boys up there than there was rich lawyers, and I said that often. But then that was in 1958, and Marvin Griffin was running he was governor, and he was running, Roger Lawson was going to be his candidate. Ernie Vandiver was the lieutenant governor, and they both came over to the university. Campus leader job really was a job that had earlier been recognized as having some political impact, from Herman Talmadge to Jimmy Bentley and on down, had been in those roles a little. And both of them offered me a job on their campaigns. But I had to go to the Army. I didn't, anyway, that wasn't part of my plan. But so in '58, when I graduated from school and went to the Army and then got married and came back farming and teaching school, then 4 years later I ran for the Senate, and under the old rotation system. And that's where 3 counties in rural Georgia would band together, and every 2 years they'd rotate the Senate seat. In the House of Representatives, each county had 1 legislator. So Berrien, Cook, and Brooks had been rotating that seat, and it was Berrien County's term to run. And so I chose to run in '62. And about a week before the election, I was running against a couple of good friends of mine, Happy Yarber from Ray City, who had run about 8 times. Every time he'd get a few more votes. He got more against me than he got against anybody, but it still was at less than 300. Hanson Carter was from Nashville, and his brother Frank Carter was a very popular physician there, and Hanson was too. So we squared off to run for the rotation Senate seat. And a week before the election, the Supreme Court ruled that the county unit system was not legal, ordered the election to be held under the popular vote, and ordered at that time that there be a special session to reapportion the state Senate. So there we are running names on the ballot in a hotly contested Berrien County race. You know, sheriffs, everybody running. And we was going to be voted on whether we wanted to or not. And so Hanson Carter and I met up at the courthouse in Nashville, and we agreed that this election, there ain't nothing to it because it don't count. And so we agreed that we would neither one campaign. That'd be the end of it. Let the people do what they wanted to do. We just threw with it because it didn't count. We shook hands on it. I come back to Enigma. He went wherever he went. That night, Marvin Griffin was having a rally at the J.H. Harvey's warehouse in Nashville, and a big fish fry. And I was sitting around here about 5 o'clock, and I said, I believe I'll just ride down there. I rode down to his rally, and honest to God, one of the first people I saw was Hanson over there shaking hands. Me and him started that same day politicking as hard as ever. And when the election's over, I'd come out on top. But then they reapportioned, and in the same time, a young fellow, nice fellow named Jack Sullivan was running against M.E. Thompson, former governor, for the Senate seat under the rotation plan for Eccles and Lowndes County. And Jack Sullivan beat him. And so it was natural when they put Berrien and Cook and Eccles and Lowndes together. He and I had both run. I'd won to represent Berrien and Cook, and he had run to represent Eccles and Lowndes. So we had a runoff in the special election. And with Enigma having 500 people, and even Berrien County having 10,000, and Lowndes County having 50,000, I didn't think there's any chance I could win. And I had pretty much told folks that, I'd went around and thanked them for voting for me and helping me get elected. But I had really decided that, I couldn't run, couldn't win, and I didn't think it was a real good use of my friends' energy just to keep on running. Julian Polk was a politically active mayor of Alapahaw. He was also on the employee of Commissioner of Agriculture Phil Campbell. And he was the political operative for Phil in this area. And as I said, mayor, Judge Lott was and is a fine judge from this county and considered the smoothest politician in the area. So they invited me to a fish fry at Julian's cabin on a Saturday morning. And they invited, I didn't know it, but they invited 40 or 50 people from the county, and Flicker Wilkes was a representative from Cook County. He came over, and they all encouraged me to run, and the word was that if we don't run somebody from Berrien and Cook against Lowndes, we won't ever be able to. And so, they raised me $325, cash money. and that's right smart for a campaign that you didn't spend on it. And so I agreed to run, and as people was leaving, Judge Lott said to me, he said, Rowan, when everybody leaves, you wait around, I want to talk to you. He said, we might can win this race. And I thought, well, you know, could be a waste of time, but whatever the judge said, I'd listen. So when everybody left, Julian Polk got him a drink of liquor and went out to a pecan tree where there's one of the tables we was eating. Judge Lott was already out there resting with him a little drink. I went out and sat down with him, and Lott told me these words. He says, we might can win the race, but you'll have to listen to me. You know, and he joked a little. He said, you know, Rowan, to win races, the greatest attributes you have is being dumb and humble. So you got to learn how to be dumb and humble. He said, now, you got to work on humility. The others coming along real good. That was 46 years ago, and I never forgot it. Then he said to me in all seriousness, he said, listen, this is a special election. All of the votes won't be counted because not many of them will vote. All we got to do is get 51% of the people that go to the polls. Not many people is going to want to go to the polls. So we've got to get enough people among our friends to get that 51% or to win. He said, now, I don't want you to go to anywhere else except Lowndes County and Lenox in Cook County. That was where he lived. He says, I want you to go to Lowndes County and Lenox and campaign. Start around your house, talk to your neighbors. I said, well, Judge, they all voted for him. Yeah, but you got to talk to them again. We got to get it back out. Anyway, that's what I'd done, except one trip when I got invited by the editor of the newspapers to go to meet with the Valdosta Times. It was nothing more than a courtesy visit, and I knew that, but I called Judge Lott. He said, oh yeah, but listen, here's what I say to him. You go down there, and I'm going to tell you what to say. So I called back Teeny Griffin, Teeny Griffin was his name, and I agreed to go down and meet with him. And when I got down there, he asked me, you know, about where I was from, and Lott had told me to say all this. He says, I know what he'll ask you. I said, well, I'm a school teacher and a farmer from Berrien County. And you know, he's asking me, I said, I was campus leader at the university when I was up there, mainly supported by the ag school. And I know I don't have much chance to win the race. And the reason I'm running is not necessarily to win, but it's because Berrien County and Cook County has already selected me as the senator. Now I know that Mr. Sullivan, whom I don't know very well, but I understand that he's a fine fellow, he was elected by Lowndes and Eccles. So I'm going to run to give the people of my area a chance to vote for me if they want to. And if, you know, I don't think I'll win, but I'm going to work as hard as I can. And if I don't win now, I might want to run again for a lesser seat, like House of Representatives or something. Well, he wrote the story just like it. And in his editorial, he endorsed Jack Sullivan. I done what Lott said. I didn't try to campaign down there. And in the endorsement of Jack Sullivan, he mentioned these words, and I still got the editorial. Bobby Rowan's a nice young man, school teacher and a farmer, and he'll get elected something one day, but it won't be this time. And Lott was so tickled when he saw me. He said, we got him now, we got him. So they don't think there's a race on. Then the editor of the Nashville Herald was Jeannie and Junie Griner. Talented people. They had pretty much took it over from the widow of Wardlaw Stalin, who died. And Lott got them to postpone their edition of the weekly newspaper, which usually printed on Wednesday and come out on Thursday, to print it on Friday and come out Saturday afternoon. So the paper came out, the last edition before the election on Tuesday. Went pretty generally all over the county because it was a well-read local newspaper, and it had a banner headline as big as the one that they had on the Atlanta papers whenever Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Elect a senator from Berry. And the fight was on then. But that night when the votes come in, Berrien County, I got 2,976 votes. And my opponent, Jack Sutherland, got 44. And in Lowndes County, I got 350, and he got about 3,100. And of course, I beat him in Cook about 1,000 to 400. So I easily won the race. But it was all because I'd worked for my strengths and had not excited my opposition. And that's still a lesson I think works today in these legislative and senatorial districts. Work from your strength. Because if you're in an area where you're popular and you get 8 people to go to the polls, you'll probably get 6 of them. If you try to get a new vote in an area you're not popular, instead of you getting 6, you'll get your opponent 6 to come out. I think that's right. But anyway, that was the way I got there. And then after I got there, I have to admit I worked real hard. I made friends. Next time I run, I carried every precinct in Lowndes County but one. And so I had made some friends, and the people down there always treated me real nice.
Let's go back to January 1963, when you began your first term, in that Senate that became known as the classiest Senate of all times. Tell us a little about that Senate, who was in it, and what you did.
Well, as I look back over the things that the good people of Georgia give me a chance to do, none of them compares to the day that I was in the first modern day Senate. I was in awe of all that was about me. I really didn't feel like I was had accomplished much. Matter of fact, when I sat down in the midst of that first Senate and saw who was around me, there was a sense of great humility. I really didn't think I belonged there. And in my wildest dreams, growing up as a child, I never dreamed that one day I'd just be voted by the accolades of the people into a Senate that comprised such great people: Zell Miller, Robert Smalley, J.B. Fuqua, Wick Knox, Pennington over from Madison, Martin Young, and Render was in the House, but Mr. Hurd, Albert Moore, Lamar Plunkett,
Julian Webb,
one of the great jurists of all time, and Frank Downing from Savannah, and it was an assortment of all the kind of people that we ought to have running government today. And I'll exclude myself from that. These are the kind of people, they were attracted because Carl Sanders brought a breath of fresh air. It was the end of the county unit system. It was the beginning of a new day. And Carl Sanders was a masterful governor. He dealt with the House of Representatives, which was 80% of them was Marvin Griffin people. They were still one man. They still was the old county unit system vote. The Senate, of course, was Carl's Senate. He had got J.B. Fuqua to run. Now J.B., he never opened his mouth in the Senate, never laughed. Of course, he certainly never cried. He was just a part of the Senate. Lamar Plunkett was a gentleman's gentleman. And to this day, if Jimmy Carter had listened to me, history would have changed some. Whenever Richard Russell died, I went to Jimmy Carter, and he got elected the same time I did. He was in that group of the first group of senators. I went to Jimmy Carter and I said, Jimmy, why don't you appoint Lamar Plunkett to the U.S. Senate? He would go to Washington. He would provide such a dignified difference for our state. He'd be a great United States Senator. And if he had appointed him, he'd got reelected. Had plenty of money, but he was a gentleman's gentleman. Bill Flowers Baking Company, came on 2 years later. But if you ask me what was the great opportunity in life, I would have to say it was learning, having a chance to be one of them, having a chance to be equals with that first group of senators. It was the great ones. And let me tell you a story about that. It shows you, I learned so much from my friends there. Martin Young didn't have any children, and he had been very successful as a county commissioner and a state senator. Served many years in the Senate. And in his home precinct, Alba out there in that county, in 7 races, Martin Young never lost a single vote except one time. There's about 100 people out there, and Martin Young got every vote every time except one time. He was running against the banker, and his neighbor come to him and told him, says, "Martin, I'm in a tight. I'm going to vote for you, but I want you to know it. But I got a note at the bank," and he says, "Ain't nobody else going to vote against you. And he'll know that we voted against him. So we've told him we're for him." Martin said, no, you go ahead and vote for him. I'm going to win anyway. So when the votes come in, there's 2 people that voted for the banker. And Martin always laughed in Atlanta. He'd say, there's 46 people went to the bank and told them they voted for him. But that's sort of the way the politics was back then. But anyway, to serve in that body, I was sitting beside Martin Young one day, about the 5th day of the legislature. And I'd read everything, Peter Zach Gear gave me a boost because he appointed me chairman of the Rules Committee. Secretary of the Rules Committee. Back then, the Rules Committee was the chairman was the lieutenant governor. And then the secretary is the one that kept the bills. And back then, they had one secretary in the whole body. She worked for George Stewart, who was the secretary of the Senate. And my job was to, every day when he assigned bills, to go get them and take them to the hotel. And the next day I was to go by before I left and get with Peter Zach, or in his absence, Al Hatcher, who was his chief of staff, and they'd give me the list of bills to bring back the next day. Now, if you can't find a bill, you can't duplicate it. So if that bill was lost, it couldn't be brought up, it couldn't be passed, nothing could happen. So Peter Zach, anything he didn't want, he just put it in that committee. And he also told me, he said, "Now, you used to be a school teacher, didn't you?" I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I want you to learn the rules of the Senate." I took him serious, and tell you the truth, before the session was over, the one thing I'd accomplished, perhaps the only thing, might have been that I could quote every rule in the rule book. And people would come to me, it gave me some power early on. They'd come to me and ask me about a rule. I'd always answer them honestly, even if I was against what they was trying to do. And then if I had a problem with the bill, I'd ask them, I said, "No, listen, don't expect you to, but if you can hit me." And they would, I'd done them a favor, they'd done me a favor. Another one in that group was Leroy Johnson. Mm-hmm. Might have been the most influential man I ever served with. But I was sitting beside of Martin Young, and I looked up the ages of everybody. Jim Westbury, who was the Baptist preacher's son, an accountant and a great friend of mine after a while. We had to warm up to one another. He thought I was a redneck, and I thought he was something different than me as well, but we finally became greatest of friends. I was sitting there and I realized for the first time that I was the youngest senator ever been elected. And nobody said nothing to me about it after 5 days. So I was sitting there with Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin would chew a piece of a cigar. And he had a spittoon pushed up under his desk. They'd moved all of them out, but he went and got his and pushed it back under. He's a real neat chewer of tobacco. He's sitting there slowly chewing tobacco. I says, Mr. Martin, he lived about 30 miles north of here, and I'd ride back and forth. I'd drive him, really, back and forth to Atlanta a good bit. And I said, Mr. Martin, you know, it's not important. But, you know, I'm the youngest senator ever got elected. Mr. Martin slowly kind of chewed a little bit, and he says, well, Bobby, I just wouldn't say nothing about it. Nobody probably won't even notice it. I thought that taught me humility more than many other lessons, but
Well,
it was a great body. Leroy Johnson came in, clearly taught me something too. He was the most effective legislator I ever served with. He had a technique that I used for many years. I've told others about it. Leroy Johnson went into his desk. You know, at that time there were members of that Senate who was very careful not to get caught shaking hands with Leroy. That wasn't me, because I guess the greatest gift I had is about the race issue was from my daddy, who stood firm against his own family. When we worked tobacco, which you had to go to Willie Cucci and get a bunch of hands to come and help you crop tobacco on your crop day, we'd go up there and get a lot of Afro-Americans. Not a lot, but 8 or 10. And some of Daddy's neighbors that came over and helped us didn't want to eat at the same table with the blacks. This was in the 40s. And Daddy, as a matter of fact, I got this stitched on the wall in there. My daddy told one of them, who said, Alvin, I don't mind working with you and all like that, but I just don't want, I just don't want to, everywhere else we go, the blacks eat in the yard and we eat in the house, Alvin says. Daddy said, well, you know, Ken, you're all right as a neighbor and friend, but listen, any man that works my fields eats at my table, black, white, whatever. Now, if that ain't satisfying to you, then we'll be friends and we just quit working together. But that's the way it's going to be here. So I think that taught me, I never really had the problem with Leroy, but Leroy Johnson would come in, very polite, sit at his desk. When you walked over to shake his hand, he was always there early, but he was always reading his bills, not trying to create a ruckus or anything. But you walk over, he'd stand up. He always addressed you as Senator. Senator Rowan, how are you doing? Say, fine. And then he would come to you during the day. You know, back then they'd have, debate and decorum, and you would, people would walk around in the chamber, and he'd come over and say, Senator, I read your bill, and I like it. I just want you to know I'm going to be supporting it. Now, he never come over and told you didn't like it. He only came and said, well, after he does that all year long, and then once in a while he had something he wanted, he'd come back over and say, but Senator Rowan, you've been a good senator. And whenever this session is over, I'm going to go down to Enigma and Nashville and Race City. I have some friends in the black churches, and I'm going to tell them I hope they reelect you, because you're a good senator. And that was good news, because back then it was real hard to get good connections without getting caught doing it. It was a sort of a tense time politically. But I remember that, and then Leroy said, oh, and incidentally, I've got this little bill. You didn't even have to read it. I said, Leroy, I'm for it. Don't worry about it. I'm for it. He was very effective. And Hugh Gillis, who was a great senator as well, and he was almost from the exact opposite spectrum of the world as Leroy Johnson. Two of them began to realize the power of each other. And there was many times when I was there when Hugh Gillis and Leroy Johnson got on the same side of an issue. It was called a mortal lock on the Senate. Nobody could beat him. The governor, the lieutenant governor, nobody. But anyway, that was such a great experience. Now, over the years, the Senate's changed. You've had other people to come in that made great contributions. But that first Senate, and even 2 or 3 Senates later, when Bill Flowers came in, not necessarily a great senator, but a great personality, his exposure to people. See, matter of fact, Bill and he liked me only because I knew the rules, and he used me from day one to tell him the rules, and he'd joke and say, Bobby Rowan and I put together the 2 richest members in the Senate. I said, yeah, I'm the poorest and he's the richest, but you put us together, we still. But it was a day of great camaraderie, and I got associated because of a committee that I was put on with the mental health issue and mental retardation, and got a chance to work really, and still do. I'm still on the board of the ARC of Georgia, and have been wherever they've asked me for all these years for the retarded citizens, because it was a chance to do some really feel-good things, and nobody rewarded you for them. The retarded citizen didn't vote. So if there was a unselfish thing that I had the opportunity to do, I think it was work in that field. I still am proud of the community. We moved them out of the institutions, but when I went to Milledgeville, mainly Gracewood, they had about 1,800 patients over there, about 350 or 400 staff people. Those people that worked there were the greatest public servants in the world. I never will forget, there's right across from Fort Gordon, where the Fort Gordon had a dog compound where they housed their dogs for the military. Their per diem was $12 a day. Gracewood, per diem was $3 a day. And it's just such a great contrast. And Central State Hospital, matter of fact, last night I was flipping through the channels and saw the old movie, The Snake Pit. You remember that? Mm-hmm. It was one of the first expose movies about the conditions in mental hospitals. To tell you the truth, Milledgeville was a lot like that in the early 60s. Ernie Vandiver changed it some. But anyway, those were great opportunities for me to do things and have fun too, and get to go to Atlanta.
How did you adjust to big city life, coming from Enigma?
Well, it didn't affect me much, because in the early days, I don't think it's that way now, regrettably. Where you in Atlanta, or where you was in Enigma, where you was in the legislature, wherever you was, you still, maintain your own life and your own friends, and paid for your own meals and paid for your own trips, and that's not the way it is now. And you go up there, and I hung out with friends of mine that was a lot like me. Old Talmadge McKinnon from Willacoochee. Mm-hmm. He was an old farm boy, come back out of the Navy and ran for office, real popular over there. And later Frank Eldridge. And so I don't know if I had much of a culture shock. I did have the habit of walking from the hotel in the morning to the Capitol, and I usually was the second person that got there. The first one was Jimmy Carter, who I knew he was headed somewhere when I first met him. I never thought it would be the White House. I picked him to be a congressman or something like that. I think that's what he picked too. He just sort of wound up the other way. But he was hardworking, and they had a big joke around. Bob Smalley was another one that worked studiously on the bills in the Senate now. Then Mark Groover was the master of the House. He came in early, but I was the early riser over there, and went around. I was mainly talking to the people that was there. It wasn't long before we hired 3 secretaries to come in and take dictation from the senators. We didn't have any to start with. You go sit outside the desk and write letters. And one of them that we hired still works for me today, Frida Ellis. Do you remember Frida?
I remember Frida, yes.
She does a little work for me when I'm in Atlanta, gets my email. Great gal. She came in there, a high-stepping, good-looking widder.
Yeah.
And what was the old boy up in the mountains? Bo Loggins.
Mm-hmm.
Bo, kind of took to her. They had a real case going a while because he was young and handsome, and she was a beautiful young girl. Still is a beautiful lady. But anyway, that was the sort of the setting in the Senate.
Speaking of Talmadge McKinnon.
Huh?
Speaking of Talmadge McKinnon, understand that you once went on a shopping trip with him. And you both bought new clothes.
Oh, that was the day we went up there. Talmadge lived over here at Willie Coochie. And he, like me, had got elected in kind of a special election. There'd been a general election, a regular election, neither one was with. And Talmadge was a handsome fella. He was in the Navy, and he parted his hair in the middle. He was about 6'3". He was about 38 or 40 years old. I was, as you said, 26. And he had a new Mercury car, but didn't have air conditioning. And when he and I went to Atlanta for the first time, we had gone, both of us, to B.C. Moore's store in Douglas and bought a new suit. And unfortunately, they had suits of all sizes, but we bought the identical suit because he had a long, tall, and my clothes, because I was always portly, I always had a little problem being fleshy. And my clothes didn't fit anyway, but we went over there, and my wife had gone with me, and we picked out this suit, and it looked good, and I could afford it. Talmadge come by here on the day we went up to Atlanta. We had registered at the Georgia Hotel, and it was just infested with about 200 legislators. You could stay down there in a private room for $5. You could share one for $9, 4.5 apiece. But there was 150 or 200 legislators in there, the country boys. The big dogs, the rich people, Jimmy Carter and Harry Jackson from Columbus, they stayed at the Piedmont. And the Dinkler Plaza is where the big liquor drinkers and the fancy people stayed, because that's where the movie stars come. That was around the corner there. And but we stayed at the old Georgia Hotel. And we pulled up there in front of the Georgia Hotel, and they had a valet parking the cars. And so we got out, and it had been hot going up there. And I'd laid my coat in the back seat, and he had laid his coat in the back seat. First time them folks I ever saw, me and Talmadge McKinnon, I got his coat and he got mine. And and whenever he walked in ahead of me, and I looked at his coat and I said, he's misbought that coat. We realized it was the same guy. You could see almost his elbows. It was like that sticking down. And I looked down and I couldn't even see. I said, Talmadge. He turned around and he said, by God, we got different coats also. Right in front of George Bagby and all that bunch of our Husky Odoms and all them in the Georgia Hotel. Me and him, they were sitting there looking at the newcomers. Me and him swapped coats before we signed up for the desk.
Let me quote you, Bobby, a story written by your friend Celestine Sibley. And I'm quoting her from the Atlanta Constitution. Rowan was one of the progressives, born of personal decency, Southern populism, and the rules of his father's house. Now, we've talked about your father, but we hadn't talked about your political philosophy. How would you define your political philosophy?
Well, Celestine's words are a lot smarter than I am, but I would agree and say that she's right. If I am anything, I'm a populist. And I believe that, we are, in fact, charged as a community, a church, a school, a county, a state, or a nation with being friends to those that are less fortunate. But that doesn't mean we don't expect them to work, do their part in whatever station of life they have. I'm not for the welfare state. I'm really for the workfare state. But I have problems when I see, and always have, always will, never really able to do a lot about it. But I don't think that we ought to forget, while man might have been born equal under the Constitution, in this life he doesn't stay equal very long. So those that are less fortunate than me, as a politician particularly, I want to be helpful to them, and I don't see anything wrong with that. That doesn't make me some liberal, wide-eyed person. It doesn't mean that I'm on a side that is different than what I am. That's just what I am. It's what my daddy was. He went through the Great Depression. I was born during the Great Depression, and he always talked about, that no man ever come out and wanted to work for food that he didn't give him food. But no man never come out and wanted money. He never gave him money either. He says, if you want to work for me, I'll share what I got. And so that's sort of what I think government ought to be doing. I don't agree with what's happening now on either party, to be honest with you, Bob. We've both got so carried away as parties to where the big bucks, I might have mentioned earlier that I ran my first race with $325, and that seemed to be enough for me. I bought a little ad or two, but mainly I got out and worked for it. And I see these legislators now being pushed to raise $100,000 to run for a Senate or House seat. I don't believe they have to have that. I really believe that if they spent the time and effort shaking hands, speaking honestly, going over the area, asking people to vote for them, I think they do just as well as a TV ad on Albany that very few people see. Stations get the money. And, I just have a problem. I don't expect to correct it. I'm not bitter about it. But if there's one thing that I believe to be true, I think I've always enjoyed the fact that I was a populist. The great populist in Georgia was Tom Watson. However, Tom Watson finally became the thing he despised, And I always, when I read his writings, he'd done so many things that I liked. And then in an effort to become greater, go to the U.S. Senate and do bigger things or whatever, in the hanging of the what was that case in Atlanta?
Leo Frank. Yeah.
Leo Franks is where he became the thing he had always despised. And, he became a Jew hater and a black hater. And, I always made up my mind that, I like the role of advocating for my neighbors and friends. This afternoon my neighbor passed away, and, he was very popular. But even if he hadn't been, even if he had been disliked, we would have been there because he was our neighbor. And that's just the way that I feel like we've missed it somewhere. Particularly in the legislature. I don't think they have to have the money that they're soliciting to win.
1962 governor's race. Young Senator Carl Sanders and former Governor Marvin Griffin. What do you remember about that race?
Well, I remember a lot about the race, but since the race, I've learned a lot more about the race. For instance, there was a critical turning point in that race. Right about where the maybe the Hyatt Regency is, or Marriott Marquis in downtown Atlanta, there was a hotel down there called the Downtowner. That was Marvin Griffin's hangout. And Marvin told me this himself. Later, Garland Byrd, who was in that 62 Senate as well, he'd been lieutenant governor, got recovered from his heart attack, and came back and ran for the Senate, in the modern day Senate. Marvin, you see, that race started out with Marvin Griffin and Garland Byrd strongly opposing one another. Carl Sanders was running for lieutenant governor against Peter Zach Geer. Peter Zach Geer's friends pulled one of the oldest stunts in Georgia politics. It was used many times in the old county unit system days, and it was get somebody with the same name to run too. So Carl Sanders is Carl E. Sanders. They got a man named Carl F. Sanders to run for lieutenant governor. Well, Carl realized that they was going to squeeze him and beat him. So he said, if that's what they're going to do, also, you see, Peter Zach was being supported by the old Talmadge group, and they was basically at that time for Garland Byrd. So he said, if they're going to do me this way, I'm going to run for governor. So when he announced for governor, Marvin Griffin, who was a shrewd, likable, charismatic, the best storyteller Georgia ever had, perhaps, friend to many people, ran many races, and was always just real solid, but a man of humor and wisdom, I think. He had been the champion of states' rights, segregation, and the county unit system. Whenever Carl announced, he realized that this thing was over. And then it became rumored that Garland wasn't feeling well. Some say that he had heart problems. Some said that he might not have. I think he probably did. His son tells me that he probably did. However, it might have been caused by the situation he is in. Because Carl Sanders announced, and that took Millsby Lane, because him and his airplane was on Carl's side. So rumor got out that Garland Byrd might drop out of the race. Marvin Griffin called him and asked him would he meet him at the Downtowner. And so he agreed to, and they met just the two of them at the Downtowner. And both of them actually have talked with me about this thing, about this meeting. Marvin said, he told him, he says, Garland, now if you will stay in this race, either me or you will be elected. Because we won't let that young whippersnapper get in it. Says, if I fight you every day, talk about how bad you are. If you fight me every day, talk about how bad I am. Carl Sanders will be out there trying to talk about both of us. Nobody paid attention to it. But he told him that day, if you get out of this race, I can't beat Carl Sanders. If I should get out, you can't beat him. You stay in, one of us will be elected. And if I get elected, I'll throw Miss Gloria, that was Garland's wife, I'll throw her a biscuit along the way, look after you. And if you get elected, then you can throw, I forgot Marvin's wife's name. He said, you can throw her a biscuit, and that'll take care of me. And he agreed to do it, but then about a week later, Marvin said he pulled out.
You've written this book, Georgia and Modern Day Legislature, which is very, very good. And in that book, you say that you think that Carl Sanders has made, or when he was governor, was probably the most progressive governor we've had in a long time, and he really made a modern state out of Georgia.
Oh, he did. He did. And he was not my kind of person necessarily. At that time, I was a country boy. I wasn't a redneck, but I was considered one. Carl was more uptown. They call him Cufflinks Carl. So we didn't start out with great admiration for each other. But I think quickly we gained great respect for each other. Me because he thought, some reason or other, probably falsely, that I could produce a product in the Senate. And him because I thought he was really good. I know how tough it is to manage the House of Representatives from the governor's office. And you know, whenever I went up to get my committee appointments, you think I talked to Peter Zach Gear? I talked to Carl Sanders.
That's the way it was back then.
That's the way it was. You went to the governor to find out what committees you're on.
Yes.
And then, you know, if you, his enforcer was the highway department, because the legislator, listen, we didn't really have any power. We could vote on a lot of things, but the budget, appointments, and all that was run by the governor's office. Absolutely. It always had been, and it stayed that till Lester. Lester got elected. That was kind of a fluke, and he didn't know the power he had, and before he got a chance to take over in January, George L. Smith had took it away from him and created the independent legislature. You see, Ernie Vanderbilt was afraid that Marvin Griffin would be elected governor in '62. See, Vanderbilt was governor. He feared that Marvin might come back. So at the end of his term, he got with George L. Smith, Flicker Wilkes from Adel, Battle Hall from Rome, and several leaders, and they passed the Independent Legislature Act, put in place the way they was going to take over committees and everything, just like they did. Mm-hmm. Well, those laws were on the books. There's to have a vote, and there's to elect their own speaker. The speaker's going to appoint everybody to committees, and all that was the way it's going to be. Well, Carl got elected, and you know how he handled that?
He said, I'm not going to do it.
I'm not going to do that. Period.
Yeah. Well, you don't blame him, do you?
No. And so he didn't, and so they didn't challenge him because he's too powerful. Matter of fact, the big fight was the House boys was going to elect George L. Speaker right on. He'd been Speaker under Vanderbilt. And so they got a big movement. I learned a lot about how politics works on this. So as we began to get up there in Atlanta on Sunday, I was around. They had the hospitality room at the Georgia Hotel. They had the big one over at the Henry Grady, you know, where everybody was. And George T. Smith was from Cairo, and I had known him. He served only 2 years. He was the only South Georgia legislator that has supported Carl Sanders and got elected. Others supported him and got beat. But he was a Carl Sanders man and only served 2 years. And he announced he was running for Speaker. George L. had announced that he was running for Speaker. And, you know, everybody assumed that, you know, the House of Representatives, 80% of them was for Marvin, you know, all strong. And so that night, I was over at the Henry Grady Hotel, and George T. walked in. And I asked him, I said, well, George, how's your race coming? I'm all right. You know, he spoke quick. He said, I'm all right, I'll win. I said, well, George L.'s people had said they had about 120 votes or something. I said, well, they're claiming they got a lot of votes. George, how many you got? I got one. That's all I need, Bobby. I just got one. You just got one? He said, yep. I got the governor. That's the only vote that counts. Well, the next day, you know, that the both sides, the more liquor they drank that night, and there was more of that than there should have been back then, and a lot more than there is now, really. They all gathered around talking about all that, and I went over to the house the next day to see them nominate George L. and George T. Well, when they called for nominations, you know who rose? George L. And I said, well, is he going to nominate himself? He got up and he nominated George T. Smith. He'd gone out to the governor's mansion that night, and he had traded with the governor on several things for his buddies and himself. And I learned then that's the way it's done. See, and George T. was elected by acclamation.
Bobby, before we get too far away, I'd like to talk for a minute about Peter Zach Gear.
Well, first of all, you got to remember Peter Zach because of his stature as a person. He had to be 6'3" with flowing red hair, a ruddy complexion that fit extremely well with the rednecks, No secret that he drank a lot of liquor, enjoyed it immensely. But having said that, in politics, there's many roles one can play. But if you want to mention the people that has the greatest talent to preside over and manage a legislative body, or even make a speech, I don't think anybody reached the heights of Peterzak. Now, you know, he wouldn't do the things necessary to be elected. He wouldn't go to the prayer breakfast. He wouldn't do things he didn't want to do. But he was a masterful presider. And his greatest performance was after he got defeated. There was a time after he was defeated by George T., when the House of Representatives and the Senate had to meet and elect by vote of the House and Senate the next governor of Georgia, because Lester Maddox hadn't got a majority. Peterzak Gear, the defeated lieutenant governor, presided over that body. It was statewide, people watched it, and if he and George T. could have run their race the next day, he would have won hands down. Mm-hmm. He was the old school. He cared for and really followed Herman Talmadge, and he was destined for greatness under the county unit system, no doubt. That's where he was headed. But when that run out from under him, he just couldn't quite fit in to the urban block. The big papers and all. He was never a favorite of any of the areas that had the political muscle where the people was. But to his death, he was a charismatic, great lawyer, and just a real contributor to the history of Georgia politics.
Talk to me a bit about 1966.
1966 was the election when Lester Maddox got elected. Now, Lester had run against Peterzak Gear, as you remember, and lost the race for lieutenant governor earlier. And was not really considered a man of great threat. I believe you had Jimmy Carter running, you had Ellis Arnold. Ellis wrote the book, Shores Dimly Seen. He reprinted that thing, that was in 42 or 3. And when he got elected the first time, then, over 20 years later, he reprinted that book and marked out Dimly Seen and put Clearly Seen. You remember that, Bob?
I remember that, yeah.
And he was a real challenge, but he was the Jimmy Carmichael Atlanta base, and Jimmy Carter was the peanut man from down here. And but Jimmy also was a liberal bent that a lot of people didn't like. You had Jimmy Gray, who was on the TV station in Albany running. He was Mr. Conservative. He had spoken at the Democratic Convention and made a great speech a year or two before that. But he was from North and was a Yankee, and he never could get off the ground, though he had more money than all of them. And Lester just had this little sign that said Maddox Country. Just all it said, just black and white, Maddox Country. And he nailed it up on walls. He come through here talking to people, and while he was talking to them, he'd nail up 5 or 6 signs. And he'd never remember anybody's names. Hey, big guy. Hey, chief. Just a sort of a little bit of a buffoon-like. But when they got to voting, there was enough racism and whatever left out there, enough dislike for Ellis Arnold, enough distrust of Jimmy Carter, until Lester Maddox came in first. And he and Ellis got in some kind of a runoff, and he won. But then Ellis Arnold's people wouldn't quit, and they petitioned. And in the general election, they got enough votes that Lester. He's running against Bo Calloway. I should have said that, the Republican who was the first real challenger in Georgia politics because he had money and was a Republican. Had been in Congress. But Lester didn't get a majority of votes. Bo Calloway might have even gotten a few more. I believe he did. And Ellis Arnold got enough to keep either one of them from getting a majority. Then by law, it had to go into the House of Representatives. So then the Democratic Party decided they'd rather have a man like Maddox instead of a man like Calloway. And the one that made that call was Herman Talmadge. He sided with Maddox. He took his machine and went to the legislators. I know this because they talked to me. We can't have Bo Calloway. All y'all have opposition. All he's trying to do is build a party. Well, I liked Bo Calloway pretty good, but I wasn't about to sacrifice for him. Rarely does a politician sacrifice for somebody he just likes pretty good. You know that, Bob. But anyway, so Lester won hands down in the vote in the House and Senate. And the one that had publicly despised Lester politically as much as anybody else was Mills B. Lane. He had really fought Lester. This is not, I really learned to really like Lester. I liked him, I disliked him, and then after evaluation, I realized that this guy was for real. So when you look at the things that I can tell you he done, he measures up in ways that most people don't. First person Lester ate with after he was sworn in as governor was Mills B. Lane at the Commerce Club. First lunch he had. But anyway, that was all right. Mills B. worked his way back in pretty well. That's all right too. I didn't follow that. Somebody had to run government.
Tell us about the Tuesday Club.
Well, I've been there. I know that every word in that book is true. And I have been speaking about the Tuesday Club with great fascination to myself. And honest to goodness, Bob, it's in the book. It was in earlier things I'd done, places I'd been and said. Never nobody, you might be the first question I ever had about it. People don't understand what was happening in this state. They don't understand that it didn't matter what happened. A few power brokers in Atlanta, Georgia, who met every Tuesday, made all the decisions. They put people where they needed to be influencers. It was a time when nobody else had money. They did. Nobody else had airplanes. Mills B. did. And this Tuesday Club was the elite of Atlanta. And let me tell you the way I got invited in that thing. After George Busby defeated me and 14 others for governor, he appointed me to the Human Resource Board. I was the only one of them that endorsed him, and I did. And I liked him. He liked me. And we had had a good 14-year relationship over in the House Senate. And so George Busby wanted to pass, this was before he appointed me, right after he took office, he wanted to pass a constitutional amendment taking taxes off the Fulton County Industrial Park. And George called me. He said, Bobby, I want to hire you to do something. He said, I want you to be my lobbyist. So I went up there to see him. And he said, you know the legislature and you can help with this. He says, we want to pass a bill exempting the Industrial Authority of Fulton County from ad valorem taxes. We got to have somebody to follow along. He said, I'm going to put a lot of muscle behind it. Carl's going to put a lot of muscle behind it. And we want you to be our man on the ground. And I said, well, George, I don't know much, but I got a feeling even now, and not knowing anymore, this is hard to do. How you gonna take out lower them taxes over out of all those rich companies when people in town no, Bobby says we got the muscle to do it, and we want to hire you to go over and do it. He says, as a matter of fact, I said, well, I don't know. Listen, I want you to go with me to lunch. And he took me to the Tuesday Club. And I was introduced as a man who was going to work with them on a project they obviously had talked about. Is there a newspaper man named Tarver?
Jack Tarver.
Jack Tarver. He presided. Every bank was there. Every utility was there. Cousins Properties was there. The old boy that had the building, funny name downtown there, he was there. Gingelot. Ginolet, no. Arthur Ginolet was there. He was president of Savannah Electric.
Savannah Electric, yeah.
But there was this builder downtown who was everybody's kind of a muscle man. He's on Ellis Street there. Anyway, nice fella. Anyway, there was about 20 people in the room. And they talked about what they was going to do. And then they assigned certain people do certain things. Like Tarver, they talked to him about an editorial at the right time. And they talked about the other, the banks, what they was going to do and everything. And, and then I went over there and I started talking to the people that had to handle the bill. And I went back to the governor. I said, "But you can't pass this." He said, "You don't think we can pass this?" "No, you can't pass it now. Some things I know, unless you're gonna take, you're gonna get your highway department and publicly you're gonna come out. You're gonna say we're gonna do this for the state of Georgia or something. But you ain't gonna pass it because the people in Fulton County don't want it, and the people outside ain't gonna vote for it unless you're for it." I said, "Bobby Rowan can't do it." So I went back a second time to the Tuesday Club, and I told them that I didn't think they could pass it. At least I said, I don't think I can pass it. Carl was there, and but anyway, the Tuesday Club. But see, what that club was this. Now Lester broke up the club because he wouldn't play ball with them. They couldn't figure where he was. They couldn't figure out who was on first and who was on second. He'd ride his bicycle off into the eternity. And so they decided they better not get caught. So they pretty much quit the Tuesday Club during Lester's era. But they decided it all started with Jimmy Carmichael. Whenever the cities really lost big, Atlanta and them, they lost big with Jimmy Carmichael getting the most popular votes, but old Gene beating him. Mm-hmm. And so they decided then, never again would they take one side. They'd buy both sides. Tuesday Club's job was to buy both sides, have somebody out there for everybody. But and that lasted until Lester Maddox saw the middle of his term. And then Jack Tarver left, who was the newspaper honcho. Mm-hmm. And, the different banks began to be bought out by others. And things changed. So they didn't have the continuity. I remember a fellow, A.B. Paget, and the guy before Bert Lance, and Virgil Jones, all the big bankers around there. But they simply got people on both sides. And whoever won, they was their best friend because they'd put more money in their campaign than anybody else. And so that was just, and so they ran the thing, from some 20-something years, the whole state.
You mentioned the race for governor. You entered that race. What prompted that decision?
Well, the fact of the matter is that I had some ambition. I had a good run in the Senate. I was, I think at the time, recognized as one of the senators that had, I hope I can say this, but I don't need to be immodest this time in my life or immodest or anything else. I'm just trying to tell the story. It wasn't a sense of greatness or anything. I thought I could do it. I talked to the smartest man in Georgia about politics and running, at least I thought he was the smartest man in Georgia, about running for governor. And he said to do it. Well, I ran, I think I might have run fifth in a 15-man race. I knew after I got in there, I had this great idea of running for governor and not taking any money. I limited contributions to $250. I ran the kind of campaign that ought to win. I had more contributors than everybody running put together. If you add up from a dime up, average contribution was $13.86. Hal Raines was a political writer for the Journal. He came down to Tifton, rode with me to Albany to make a speech. Wrote an article coming back on that as a result of that trip, and I was no longer a candidate anymore because he said these words. He said, Bobby Rowan is a good fella, probably make a good governor, but you can't beat your opponent to death with an empty money bag. George Busby repeated that. He staged a question. Norman Underwood's one doing it. He staged a question in Albany. He flew into the airport, and he had one of them to ask him, what about Bobby Rowan? He says, you're sharecropping with Georgia Power. And I did, I put my ad on the front page. I got a lot of publicity, particularly after I found out I wasn't going to win. And that didn't take long. But George said, well, Bobby Rowan would be a great governor. He's a good fellow, a good friend of mine. If I get elected governor, I'm going to appoint him something. I want him to help me run the state.
And he did.
Well, he did, but what the hell do you say about that? I'd been kicking him in the ass. I'm sorry, edit that out. I'd been kicking him around. How do you go back when a man who said you're great, be a great governor, a good friend, he's going to ask you to help run government? What do you say? He preempted me. So from then on, I was a man that didn't have enough money to win. And so that, I didn't, and I wouldn't have won. But anyway, I was fighting to stay up top among the ones that was doing things. But it was all a matter of, it happens to a lot of people. I listen to myself, but Bob, the fact of the matter is, politicians tend to do that. If you listen to yourself, you could make some real serious errors about political judgment. But I wanted to be governor, and if I'd have been governor, I even to this day think that the populism I would have brought into play, and maybe along the way, out of the governor's mansion, I had young kids, and I always joked about if I'd got elected, I'd cut a hole in the damn fence out there so my neighbors come play with my youngins, and I probably would have. But anyway, that race, because maybe I didn't get angry, I didn't lose focus, I ran as if I might win, knowing, see, whenever they collapse me on, if the newspapers say you can't win, you can't. Because you have your own friends. Now, I've carried this area down here. I've done all right in Athens and a little bit in DeKalb County and places, but clearly not enough to be a contender. But that race, because I went all over Georgia, when I ran later for the PSC, that's what elected me. Not only running the race, getting to know people, but making friends and not enemies. Mm-hmm. After I saw I was going to lose, I didn't jump on Busby anymore. I just done clever things and, talked about chasing Burt Lance's Learjet in a pickup truck and done anything to sort of put my ad on the front page, and had a great time with the race. If you know you aren't winning and you're not bitter, and if you like people, how else could a man from Enigma, Georgia, walk in a clothing store in West Point, Georgia, go through it and shake hands, greet people, say hello, ask them to vote for you, and leave? What else? How else could do that? If you went in there just as an individual and shook hands, run you out. They think you're going to shoot them or something. A politician has a great chance to meet people. And if he's successful, and if he's sincere, a great chance to do good. See, county government don't have the resources to do really great things for the people. Washington is too big. You can't influence it even if you get up there. You know, even the legislators, senators, they can't, the bureaucracy runs it. You can't do nothing as an individual in Washington. It's the state government that you can influence because you'd have better schools, better health care, better roads, better buses, and anybody that has a vote and is willing to vote can have an impact.
Jimmy Carter followed Maddox in the governor's office by defeating Carl Sanders. I want to give you a quote from a story in the Atlanta newspapers by Bill Shipp, friend of yours, and I'm quoting, "Carter ran a campaign that was groundless and vicious." Is that a fair description? I don't really think so. I think Carter ran a campaign that was a little, it was a campaign run on the elements of political success. Now, he made a main issue about Carl Sanders not inviting George Wallace over to speak. But yet Carl Sanders was far more conservative than Jimmy Carter. And you know, he abandoned that rhetoric on the day he was inaugurated on, because when he made his inauguration speech, all of us were surprised. Because I knew, I was standing close by outside, I knew that it was an agenda, Bob, that was not for the state of Georgia. I knew then. I thought it was U.S. Senate maybe. But anyway, I don't think that, I think it was a campaign that was based upon certain elements of politics that had a degree of success, of being successful. Now I say that because Carl fell into it. You see, he let himself be portrayed as Cufflinks Carl. He was too proud to tell the truth. It wasn't Carl that should have been Cufflinks Carl. He was a self-made man. His daddy, you know, worked in the mill. He was from Augusta, smart young kid, come up hard, made a lot of money and was successful. It was Jimmy Carter that was the son of the king. Had money and land and property, went to the Naval Academy and done all these things. Jimmy Carter portrayed himself as a peanut farmer from South Georgia, redneck. Carl Sanders portrayed himself, or allowed himself to be portrayed as a rich, successful lawyer from Atlanta, and neither one of them was true. But I think that, I would say I would disagree with my friend Shipp, because I think it was the politics of the day, and it wasn't nasty enough to be considered terribly offensive on most things he done. And maybe Carl played into him. Now, as I said, I already said that Carl Sanders is one of the great governors of all time. He was focused on Georgia. He brought it out of the county unit system. He certainly helped solve, he and Vandiver, the integration crisis. We never suffered like Alabama. Nobody ever stood in the courthouse door. If Carl Sutton hadn't got elected, we'd have faced all of that Alabama did. And our state, you see, what made Georgia great is when we solved the integration problem, Mayor Hartsfield, Carl Sanders, Vandiver, whenever Georgia became a place when people up north didn't fear to come to, and when the Southern Company built enough electricity that we could air condition Georgia. Air conditioning was essential. Georgia would have never gone without adequate electricity. Air conditioning, solving the integration problem,
is the reason Georgia's growing today just like it is. Because people up north that come down here, they didn't have to get outdoors among the people. Mm-hmm. They didn't necessarily like Georgia people, but they got out of the sun belt, the snow belt, too cold down here. Summer's all right because they got air conditioning. I think Jimmy Carter was a man that clearly was able to stay focused on the mission. I think he went after Carl Sanders. But he had suffered defeat 4 years earlier. Many said because he allowed himself to be portrayed what he was. Gray was the conservative, he was the liberal, and Ellis Arnold was more liberal or whatever, but he came in third. If he'd have come in second, probably we'd have never heard of Ellis Arnold. Of Maddox. Mm-hmm. If Maddox hadn't got in that race, we'd never heard of him. We would have heard of him, but he wouldn't have been a leader. And Jimmy Carter would have never been president.
But Maddox was successful, Bobby, though, in becoming lieutenant governor after he was governor. And for 4 years, we went through the fights between Maddox and Carter over, first of all, reorganization, and then everything else. Now, you were up there during all that. Tell us about that period.
Well, first of all, Maddox's greatest victory was not being elected governor. That was his greatest accomplishment. But that was handed to him by a mix of things that normally wouldn't have happened. The legislature, Herman Talmadge going against Callaway, and everybody deciding to get behind him. Anyway, but when he ran against George T. Smith, that race was for real. He won it because he was popular, and it was his. And he and Jimmy were on, just like I'm a populist. Lester was not he was not a racist. He was a segregationist. He believed that. Yet he appointed more blacks as governor than anybody's ever appointed, and more women. He didn't have and he appointed some really honest people to jobs that often before people that might be less honest was appointed to, like on pardon and parole, like a lot of other things he'd done. So, and I didn't have a fault. I had a great disappointment with him, and he did me, I'm sure, because the problem I had whenever I was one of his floor leaders, working with Maddox, was that everybody else was his floor leader, and I'd go down. One day I went down there and they wanted certain of the ag people. I was an ag person. And I went down to Lester's office and I said, Governor, a lot of the agriculture people, the Farm Bureau and everybody, wants a sales tax off farm machinery. I don't know if I ever told this story. And I said, my friends, I'm a farmer too. We'd like to do it. He said, well, Bobby, I think it was Jay Butler said, we can't afford to do that. It's cost us $30 million. And I said, well, Governor, to be honest with you, I think you're probably right. And you tell me that we can't do that, if you're going to oppose it, then, I'm on your side. I'd go back down there and tell them that you're not going to let that happen, that you're against it. Can't afford it. And I did. Well, Ford Spinks was in the tractor business. And he and I were great friends, and we've discussed this a little bit. Ford was president of the Tractor Dealers Association. And he went down to see Maddox. He'll quit. He went down to see Maddox same day. I went to Al Holloway and everybody and told them that Lester couldn't do that. And Ford went down there and took a couple of people with him. I don't know exactly who. And Lester agreed that he had supported. And he came back up to the floor and took the well of the House and said, Governor Maddox had just authorized me to read this statement. And he read Lester's statement saying he supported what he just sent me to fight for. And that just irritated me, so I didn't say nothing, but I decided the best thing for me to do, because I didn't want to stay bitter all my life about it. I didn't dislike him. The best thing for me to do is just quit and let him get somebody else. And he did. He got Mike Padgett, and that was better for him because Padgett's agenda was different than mine, and that was okay. But anyway, see, that's what I disliked about Lester as governor. Now, is because people done him that way more often than they should. But he still was not what people said he was. He didn't deserve the licks he got. He never got the credit he did deserve. And most of all, see, everybody else is rich. And I tried to get the legislature to pass funding for his retirement. You know, Busby had it, everybody else had it. Lester Maddox was, before he died, was in desperate financial straits. You know that better than anybody, Bob. Mm-hmm. The legislature wouldn't do anything for him. That was one of my great disappointments with the legislature. That was a sense of fairness. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Lester, as lieutenant governor, he pretty much stayed on his philosophy, and he was, but he won that race because he was a popular Georgian.
How about reorganization?
Reorganization needed doing. I'm not sure it accomplished anything close to what Jimmy envisioned. It needed doing because it hadn't been done since Richard Russell was governor. There was 237 departments, separate line items and all that, departments. And Jimmy came in. If I had to criticize it, and I've said this before, I think he tried to do too much too soon with too little. Case in point, I was active in the mental health, mental retardation movement, and I was trying to separate them rather than put them together because of one thing. If you say, I've had numbers of people say to me, you know, I always support the mental health programs that you for, Bobby. That'll go away. Because I really support retardation. Mental health is not retardation. They're not treated the same thing. There's a cure for mental health, and there is a training opportunity for mental retardation. It's not something that has a cure. So I wanted to separate them, but Jimmy put them together, and that was the point that I disagreed with him on. But I thought reducing human resources to a smaller number was good. So on balance, at the end of the day, we was better off having went through the reorganization. It didn't prove to be as effective as many hoped, but it was worth doing only because something needed to be done.
How would you rate Maddox as a lieutenant governor?
Better than governor. I think it's because he wasn't a bad governor, but often he didn't govern. You know, he didn't govern. He simply didn't govern. And let me give you a case in point. When he got elected in November, when he got elected in January, Carl Sanders, Flicker Wilkes, and George L. Smith had already drawn up his 2-year budget. Mm-hmm. Maddox had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even governor. Then they took Flicker Wilkes. He resigned from the legislature and became Maddox's budget director. So it was 2 years, and they convinced Maddox that what we needed was to be in favor of an independent legislature. Now, I thought that was a mistake and said so because I knew what was going to happen, see. So really, the same people that ran government under Carl Sanders pretty much continued for a couple of years. It took Maddox about 2 years to learn everything, but he did learn it, and then he brought in some people. Mike Patchett, became closer to him, and he was Johnny Caldwell helped him some, Tom Murphy, so they began to bring Maddox into the fold, and so I think the end of his administration, he was better. That's clearly shown by the fact George T. was a pretty good lieutenant governor, pretty popular, pretty articulate, and pretty honest. Had a lot of friends. Lester beat him handily. Mm-hmm. So I would rate him as one of the good lieutenant governors. Not necessarily the best one, but a good lieutenant governor. And we had so many fair governors until I'd count him a fair governor. Not a bad one. He was strong on the moral side, Bob. He was weak on the knowledge of administration.
That brings up an interesting point that we've discussed quite often, and that is that most of our governors in modern Georgia have served in the General Assembly.
I believe all of them except Maddox. If you name them coming down, you see you had, from way back, from Richard Russell, Ed Rivers, Ellis Arnold, Speaker of the House, I believe. Then you had Emmy Thompson wasn't in the legislature, but he was acting governor. And of course, Gene Talmadge, Herman wasn't in the legislature, but then Marvin was in the legislature, and then Vandiver was been president, lieutenant governor, and adjutant general, and then of course you're going through the list, all of them, even through Sonny Perdue, except Maddox, was product of the legislature. I think that's pretty good because as a legislator, they learn, if they think they're going to be governor, they're mostly studious and in a learning mode, and they learn about not only how to budget, but the limitation of the budget process. They learn that we ain't got $20 billion now to budget because 98% of it is already budgeted. You can't cut the school teachers off. You can't stop the paving of the roads. You can't stop school bus drivers. You got to have health care. You got to pay the health care workers. So all that is a continuation budget. And up top there's about 2% when you can affect welfare and other things, if you want to have a partisan agenda. The legislators learn that, but it's something you don't learn unless you've been there.
So you had served in the Senate, you had run for governor, and then you decide later to run for the Public Service Commission.
That's right.
Why did you want to get back into politics?
I didn't necessarily want to get back in politics. Mr. Short, you assured me to start with this was a page for history. And where anybody ever looks at it or sees it is not a great concern to me. My job, if I have one, is to speak fairly truthful and to mention some of the reasons I've done certain things that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren can observe if they want to and have good, clean answers. You've asked me one now. Why on earth, after 14 years of being absent from politics, though I had been on the Board of Human Resources, which was a continuation of the labor of love for the disadvantaged and disabled, part of the populism in me continued. So I wasn't out of it all, I wasn't in politics. Why would I want to get back? And why would I want to run for the PSC? If you'd had one more week and $10,000 in 1970, you would have won the public service. And then I'd be interviewing you instead of you interviewing me.
Thank the Lord I lost.
Yeah, it's the best thing to do. But anyway, why did Bobby Rowan run for the PSC? Well, first of all, Ford Spinks was retiring, and he and I had been friends and had served together. I had encouraged Jimmy to appoint him, and we had gone back as friends and neighbors and still are. He's still he's really a good friend of mine. He was retiring. He wanted me to take his place. Well, I really didn't think I wanted to be on the PSC. You had Pafford over there, and Pafford proved to be one of the most miserable people that I have ever known anywhere, anytime, and the biggest hypocrite. Southern Bell and to a lesser extent Georgia Power, they owned him lock, stock, and barrel, but he put up a facade. He never went out and eat with them. Well, he didn't, because they hauled stuff to his place. Anyway, he was just there. Anyway, and then why would I want to run for the PSC? Also, why would I think I could win? I've been out 14 years. And then, Bob, something happened to me. I was, at the time, I went broke farming. And that's a great experience. If everybody could be assured of having been successful and coming out of going really broke, that is one of the most learning experiences you can ever do. In my case, I went stone broke in the cattle business when everybody else went broke. My neighbors was pretty much broke. And I had the blessings of Job, and that, I went broke, and then I came back with things were better because I had friends. That's what made it. But anyway, I was had gone back to lobbying and had a little more presence in Atlanta, had a client or two, Life of the South, and to get registered for lobbying up there to start with, I didn't have anybody. So I registered under the Enigma Brotherhood of Farmers. Got me a big tag. You can't walk around, what the hell are you doing here, Rowan? So I went down and registered as the lobbyist for the Enigma Brotherhood of Farmers, and I spun a yarn about being, about 20 people down here that meet every 5 o'clock every morning and so forth. And now that I was a lobbyist, then I could get another client or two, and Butch Houston got me to do some things. So I'd gotten back in it in '86, as I mentioned, like that. And then Ford wanted me to run for it. And I didn't want to run. I didn't think I could, didn't have any money, was just recovering. But then, the last of the session in '88, this story's not going to be long, and it's probably off point. You can take it out if it is. I thought I had the flu the last week of the session. Me and Hanson Carter was staying at the old hotel, it was now the Sheraton, but it was then something else. We were staying over there, staying together, really. And the last week of the session, I just had the flu. I was so sick I couldn't even go over there. But I didn't want to go away because I had 2 or 3 little bills, and I needed to follow it. So the day the session was over, I called the doctor in Tifton, told him I had the flu. And I got in the car, left before it was over. And I drove to Tifton. And this had to be around March the 8th or 10th. And I went to the doctor. And he come in there and looked at me, and he left. Come back out, and he drew a blood sample, and he left again. He come back in. He said, I don't know what you got, Rowan, but you ain't got the flu. I'm putting you in the hospital. So, turned out I was bleeding to death. I had colon cancer, and it was, the tumor was, because of, I'm big in the girth anyway, it was not detectable. And I was just bleeding. And that's the reason everything was so low. I was about to bleed to death. They put me in there, and on March the 16th, they operated on me. Colon cancer. Whenever they got through, I didn't have any problems. I didn't have to have a colostomy. I was real fortunate. I just had a recovery period of about a month. And while I was in recovery, I realized my station in life. I had a potential to build a little lobbying business and to stay in Atlanta and make enough money to survive having gone broke. But I didn't have any health insurance. Here I am with a $15,000 bill, which I could pay. That ain't much. Today it'd be $300,000. And didn't have any health insurance. And I realized that if I got elected to, Ford Speaks has done talk to me, if I got elected to the PSC and stay healthy for 1 month, I've got health insurance the rest of my life. You know, because I already had 13 or 14 years in. So I made up my mind in the hospital. I was going to run for that job, bust my ass to get it, do all I could to get it, work as hard as I could, 24 hours a day, beg my friends to help me, because I wanted that job because I needed the health insurance. Now you might say that's such a foolish thing. But you see, I could have faced chemotherapy. I could have faced a continuing, could have got my lymph. I could have faced bills that nobody can pay, doctor bills. You've got to have either some kind of government agency or health insurance, something can pay. You can't pay enough to pay your doctor if you have a bad problem. And so I ran because I knew, and I was honest about it. If I could get elected, I had health insurance for me and Barbara, and that was important to me. And actually, so anyway, I run, and a lot of people helped me, and I got elected. You know, I went to Culver Kid, had one day for 5 counties down there, brought in the sheriffs and everybody. They cooked the fish, furnished the liquor, and put on a party, and I carried every county, never went back. So it was friends helping me, but I needed that. I got it, and then in '94, times was changing, and I wasn't as passionate then. I couldn't be, because I had, you know, I'd had enough years I could involuntarily separate. So I had my retirement in place. So in '94, when I lost, I didn't just back off and cry about it. Matter of fact, I wrote a book. I hope I give you in 3 days, and if I didn't, I'd give you one. Talking about my 34 years of public life. Mm-hmm. Is before I wrote the other one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm anxious to read it. Let's talk a minute about some of your friends. Zell Miller.
I think it was Ed Jenkins who described Zell as two Zells. You know this much better than me, as Zell and Ezell. So I'm not plagiarizing. I'm giving an honest discussion of my opinion of it. Doesn't take a thing from him. I don't think. I wouldn't want to do that, really. I have no reason to. He was always very nice to me on most occasions. But Zell Miller could turn from your best friend to a man you're almost afraid of right in front of your eyes. Now, you've seen him. It's surely happened to you. And but basically, Zell Miller was a far deeper thinker than most people thought. Pretty much thought through most issues. And as a result, he was a good lieutenant governor. Now, when he ran against Herman Talmadge and got defeated, and then Mattingly beat Talmadge, I think Zell made a change in his life, and he decided then he was going to abandon some of the issues. You know, at that time he was real pro-labor union and was real Mr. Liberal and Mr. Democrat. He changed and became a little more acceptable to the Georgia political life, and as a result of that, he was on a track to becoming governor. Then he had a few friends who, either because of nobility or selfishness, like Virgil Williams and others, that wanted a governor in the White House, in the governor's mansion. And they early on put a lot of money into him as lieutenant governor to run for governor, and nobody could really catch him. Murphy misstepped. He backed Bubba McDonald, and that was a real disaster because most people thought he could sing, and when he got around the state and they heard him sing, they didn't like his singing. He really couldn't sing. He's the only man that wanted to sing I ever saw. That somebody should have stood up and say, hell, you can't sing. But he enjoyed, he'd break into a song, and Murphy backed him. Roy Barnes running on his own. Zell was running. Andrew Young was running. Andrew wasn't never going to get there. And I think Bubba McDonald got 6% of the vote. Roy got almost enough to force Zell into a runoff. If Roy had got a runoff with Zell, he might have beat Zell at that time. But it's good he didn't, because Zell went on to become governor for 8 years, and then Roy became governor, and a better governor than he'd been back then. And then, you know, he and Bobby Conn, you know, if neither one of them had been lawyers, he might have beat Perdue. But, you know, a trial lawyer thinks they're smarter than anybody in the world. And Roy wouldn't listen, you know that? Good fella, good friend of mine, or Bobby Conn wouldn't listen. They didn't think he had to have any South Georgia people. And he didn't get as many as he should have. He got me, but you know, he didn't get as many as he should have. But Zell was, if you add up the years he was lieutenant governor and then governor, I give him high marks for keeping Georgia on a stable course and being a fairly well-liked governor with a vision for the future. Now, I'll have to tell you, and I don't think I'd say this to Zell because no reason to hurt him, but I want to rank him, I still call him governor, not U.S. Senator. For whatever reason, he missed his balance up there, and it culminated, is that the way you say that word? Anyways, work on that. In a performance that I was not proud of. The Republican convention. He came out angry, looked angry, he didn't act friendly, he missed his audience, he left angry, and I think that hurt him. One of the few things he'd ever done that really turned south on him. Now, that's my opinion. My opinion, because it was not the characteristic Zell. You see, the Zell side was one of the most persuasive, diplomatic, political persons I've ever known. That was Zell that walked out on the stage that night. That was clearly Zell. You know what I'm talking about, the Democratic convention.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But I liked his book pretty well. I thought he was on target with his book. I don't agree with all of it, but I say I'd count him as one of the people that made a difference. Carl Sanders made a difference. Zell Miller made a difference.
While we're on the subject of party politics, what do you think is the reason for the Republican Party takeover of the governor's office in the state capitol?
I think if you want to really reach down into the genesis of it all, it was when the legislature funded public television and the lawmakers. Now, there are political active people that watch the lawmakers. Some of them that are not politically active. It's a choice to watch. Many of them look at it to see if they see their legislator. A lot of people watch the lawmakers. Now, when you see the lawmakers beginning in about 1992 or 3, the Republicans, when they interviewed a Republican legislator, or when they got in the well, they really made a pretty good impression. Most of the time were fairly reasonable people, even maybe a few of them up your way is not, some of the abortion radicals is way beyond anything reasonable. But basically they were pretty well looked upon as pretty acceptable Georgians you want to be with. Now, whenever the Democrats got up there to speak, it was mostly radical, very liberal, mostly Atlanta oriented, and the public out in the state that was making decision making decided the Republicans in the legislature looked a little better than the Democrats. You know, I shouldn't call names, but Gonzalo James, good friend of mine, but didn't make a real great impression, didn't entice the party too much, because she had a radical stance and she stood it. I think that was the beginning of the erosion. Then you had the Democrats with too much power. Newt Gingrich came up with a gimmick rather than a strategy The gimmick was a contract on America. It sounded good. It should have been good. And he swept things out, including me out of office, Warner Rogers out of office. Almost got Zell, almost got everybody. It was a good strategy. And then they became too powerful. And now, to be honest with you, the pendulum is swinging back. People's beginning to decide, as I view it, they're not real sure about this, this all Republican government. George Bush is not very popular. I noticed in the program the other night, Reagan was mentioned, Clinton was mentioned, but you know who wasn't mentioned? George Bush. Mm-hmm. Neither side. Obama probably shouldn't, and McCain wouldn't. So, politics has changed, but I think it changed because, and you've got to remember now, there's a certain amount of racism in the state. There always has been, there always will be, and that played against the Democratic Party.
So you feel like many disenchanted Democrats that the state party is too urban and too dependent on minorities and unions for support?
I would say that's really the trouble. And I remember a conversation that Marcus Collins and I had with Roy Barnes and Bobby Kahn. If you talk to Roy, you mostly talk to Bobby too, So we went in to tell him that he wasn't doing good down here among us white conservatives. Me and Marcus was for him. A lot of people like us was for him, A lot of us didn't want to be part of the Republican movement, didn't feel comfortable there. And so we went down there to his office, and Marcus would have done more talking than me. I just kind of added to it. He said, Governor, you got to pitch us white folks a bone. He said, it looks like y'all just left us. He said, everything y'all doing up here, you're doing for, and he named some names that I don't have to name. And the leaders up here that, down home, folks don't think you care about us. And I was surprised at the words that Bobby Kahn came up with. He said, well, Bobby, it's the reason we're going where the votes are. Mm-hmm. He says, white conservative men are not going to vote for us, not going to vote for Roy Barnes. And I said, well, what about the school teachers? He said, well, I'm gonna work on that a little bit, but he never did. It was really the school teachers that beat him the most. It wasn't the flaggers because there's not that many of them. But he said, that's not where the votes are. I thought then it was a mistake because there was no way I could help Roy Barnes unless he'd give me something to help him with. Mm-hmm. As he does something I can talk to the farmers about or whatever. So we really had no tools if you were a white Democrat. And so Roy lost them, most of them.
Before time runs out, let's get back to Bobby Rowan. Bobby, you're a legend in state politics, not only for the serious contributions you've made, but also for your fun-loving side. I'd now like to ask you to confirm or deny some Bobby Rowan stories. Did you really write the famous speech delivered by Senator Roscoe Dean?
Well, the truth of the matter is that is absolutely true. I've never heard it told that it was embellished to the point where it wasn't true. And if I wanted to dig through my archives, I could come up with a handwritten speech that I wrote for him and took it to the governor's office in the back, where gorgeous lady that's now deceased was working from Cedartown. Her daddy was a sheriff over there.
Yvonne Redding.
Yes. She typed it up in big, broad, speech-type type, and I give it to Roscoe Dean, and I give you my word, that occurred in 1964, and I believe in the course of the next 10 years, I've done a lot of good things, Bob, but as I travel around the state, I'm always chagrined The only damn thing anybody remembers is that speech I wrote for Roscoe Dean. But I can't deny it because it's all true.
Well, tell us about the speech.
Well, you got to remember, I might have earlier said that I was elected campus leader at the university. Roscoe Dean was a freshman over there, and he aspired to be like Gene Talmadge. Combed his hair like old Gene. He had a flock that fell down in front. And over there, he was always wanting to associate with people he thought had power. So I was campus leader, and Roscoe became one of the people that I could count on to do certain things politically. And he also had a little honorary. He was in the Greeks had some little fraternity he was in, and it wasn't nothing, but he wanted to be on the X Club, and he wanted to be in the honoraries, and the campus leader, and had a lot to do with that, who was nominated and who got it after they was nominated. Roscoe figured I was a man of some power, which wasn't necessarily true. And he attached himself to me a good bit, and I got to know him. He gave everybody over there a Christmas present, a little pen or a nail file or something, every student. And every married student, Roscoe Dean, give a Christmas tree. 6,200 students over there, about 800 of them lived in married houses. So he was then running for something. His life was politics and food and liquor, and he couldn't drink liquor. His mama was deeply religious. But anyway, so then 2 years later, Bill Zorn was the senator from Jessup, and one of my very best friends, and one of the best lawyers, country lawyers I ever knew. And we became great friends. And then when Roscoe ran against him, I tried to help Zorn, and but Roscoe beat him 2-1 in every precinct. He was a masterful strategist. He was the Karl Rove of the 60s, really. He knew what to say, how to hurt you. And back then, I remember we had, you had self-service gas. Bill Zorn told me this story, and Roscoe didn't deny it. I confronted him with it. There was a big black man driving an old smoking Cadillac. Went all over the county with big Bill Zorn signs on it. Pull up and rudely blow his horn and get out smoking a cigar, and ask him, put him in a couple of dollars of gas, and don't mind check the gas, and windshield's kind of rusty. And of course, they'd do it because that's what they're supposed to do, but they'd let, and then he'd get in the fire up that thing, and it'd make a bunch of smoke on the thing. And then he'd say, "You boys don't forget to vote for my old good friend Bill Zorn. He was the nicest man. He helps our church." He drove off there. You can imagine what those. Anyway, that was some of his tactics. But Roscoe was, again, like the Jimmy Carter thing earlier, he was playing what it was that was winning for him. He came over to the Senate, though. His first bill was outlawing nudity in Georgia. 20,000 church signatures outlawing nudity, banning it completely, all public and private public places. Well, we didn't have no nudity in Georgia. It wasn't legal anyway. But Roscoe, I says, "Roscoe, it's already illegal. Don't matter, we're going to pass the bill, be sure it don't happen again." So he got a lot of mileage out of that, and it's pretty well figured out he was a political fluke. He voted for every appropriation for anything, voted against every tax increase. Well, I began to realize that on issues that Roscoe didn't know anything about, I could vote him. So I sort of added to my political strength in the Senate by spending a little time with him, and he'd come to me and want me. Roscoe done all of his speaking by rising on a point of personal privilege. He didn't debate. He couldn't think. He didn't think he was. Anyway, he didn't do best in a debate for him. He done best when he prepared himself, got up and delivered. It was always targeted. but he was always wanting to fight anybody that had taxes. Well, I wrote him a speech about tobacco and wrote him a little point of personal privilege, little 5-10 minute things, and he'd rise up and he began to trust me. And then Carl Sanders come out with a bill, got it introduced by his floor leadership, raising the tax on cigarettes. And Roscoe immediately come to me. He said, Bobby. He's a very impatient man, sort of. You got to help me write a speech. Good gracious, I want you to write a speech. I'm going to fight Carl Sanders' tobacco tax. And I said, Roscoe, I don't know if I want to write you a speech about that. Now, I'm inclined to vote against it if I can figure out how I can get away with it. But I'm not one to want to kick Carl in there. You got to help me, Bobby. Won't tell a soul. Won't tell a living soul. Won't tell a living soul. Well, I decided, maybe I'd have a little fun. So I was over at the staying at the hotel. And you remember old Bob Andrews?
Very well.
He died a year or so ago. He was a clever fella. Drank, as I did at that time, too much liquor, but a great fella. Lived at Gainesville. And so Bob Andrews and Frank Eldridge was over there, and I began to write Roscoe's speech. And the more we wrote, the funnier it got. And Bob Andrews added some lines, the voice of the turtle shall walk in all the land, a quote from Solomon, So we just had a good time drinking a little bit of liquor and just having fun with Roscoe's speech. And then I wrote it, as I said, I was writing it all down. And then I went and got it typed up. And I never dreamed Roscoe would give the speech. I thought when he saw that speech, he'd laugh at it and say, Rowan, you rascal, what are you trying to get me to do? But he didn't. Looked at it, went in the little pantry room there, read it and come out. Always had a cigarette and a message. Rowan, the best one you ever done, best speech you ever wrote. I realized then, I said, listen. I said, well, don't say anything about it, Roscoe. I'm not out to fight together. I'm probably going to vote with you, but don't. Oh, I won't say anything about it. And then he turned, it wasn't 3 minutes later, I heard him tell the fellow, says, Rowan's a good speechwriter. I knew that. But anyway, here was the speech. First of all, it was a speech against Carl Sanders' tobacco tax. And it started out, we had written the speech where you write a paragraph that makes some sense. And then you just go absolutely crazy with the next line. Then you come back to some sense of civility, and then you go crazy again. So it started like this. It said, gentlemen, I rise today to oppose the bill by Governor Carl Sanders doing further damage to a desecrated industry, raising tobacco by imposing upon them a tax that is unfair, unjust, and unlikely to succeed in accomplishing the goal that Governor Sanders is proposing. Certainly is not likely to succeed with my support. Then the next paragraph said, now, gentlemen, nepotism is no excuse for extemporaneous frivolity. Well, when he read that, and he had practiced for the mirror, he told me that. Now, gentlemen, nepotism is no excuse for extemporaneous frivolity. Well, then he got through that, and it said, that the evils of putting all the tobacco farmers in a state of economic distress, and made a little sense. Then the next line, when I took the speech to Roscoe, I stood him before me, and it's still that. I said, Roscoe, I'm going to tell you a Rodney Dangerfield one-line joke. A speech this great should surely have a clever side to it. I'm going to tell you a joke. And I told him a one-line joke, like Rodney Dangerfield uses. I can never remember what that joke was because he didn't give it. But in the speech writer's preparation, they put in parentheses, now tell the joke. And I was just sitting there cringing when he got down to that paragraph. And then Roscoe said, "Now tell the joke." And everybody just rolled. They said, "What in the hell is going on?" And then it sort of leveled off. And then his last paragraph said, "Gentlemen, I rise to quote the noted philanthropist and tobacco farmer who spoke these immortal words over 50 years ago, P.J. Puddin Willis from Pearson, Georgia, who said, 'Gentlemen, I prefer no further taxes.'" And that lived on. Why it lived on, I don't know. And you think my friend Andrews or my friend Eldridge acknowledged knowing anything about that? No.
Well, Bobby,
Let me tell you the quick end of that story. I knew I wasn't going to get away with writing Roscoe's speech against the governor. You know what I'd done? As soon as I could get up on it, I run down to the governor. "Governor, I want to tell you, I just want to talk to you a minute. And you got a liquor tax and you got a cigarette tax. Cigarette tax hurts me a little bit. I'd plan to keep my mouth shut and vote against it. But if you'll let me off the hook on the cigarette tax, I'll vote for your liquor tax." He didn't answer me directly. He said, "Senator, did you write Roscoe Dean's speech?" I said, "Yes, Governor, I have to admit I did, but if I'd known the dumbass was going to give it, I wouldn't have written it." So, but he laughed. I voted for his liquor tax, and I voted against the cigarette tax.
Well, let me ask you this question. Did you really introduce a Senate bill requiring voters to be dead at least for 3 years before they can vote?
That was a time of great frivolity, and one of the facts is wrong. It was 2 years.
2 years.
However, anything less than 2.5 years was to be considered as just 2 years. Let me tell you the way that was. That happened in 1964 in the summer. Carl Sanders had decided he wanted to rewrite the Constitution. And he didn't do it correctly because you're supposed to have a constitutional convention. He called the legislature together in the summer. We had a special session. And you have two bodies. The House was very deliberative on the constitutional revision. You had people like Al Fowler, and you had great constitutional lawyers, Denny Groover, and they was going to work for several weeks on rewriting the Constitution. Well, what was the Senate going to do? At that time, Jimmy Carter had just proved in court that the election process was flawed, and he had gotten, before that, he had gotten, him and Charlie Kerbo had got him put in the Senate. You know, he lost and all that fight. So the election code needed reforming. So Carl Sanders assigned the election code to the Senate and let us perfect it while the House perfected the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was going to take 4 or 5 weeks, and did. Rewrite the election code was almost a 30-minute session, because all you had to do is just declare that it had to be honest. You know, if you voted the dead, you had to do better than that, vote them in alphabetical order, which is what they done when they got caught, you know. Voted 100 people out of the cemetery in alphabetical order. Anyway, we didn't have no time. So Peter Zach Gear called all of the chairmen in. He said, "Listen, we got a problem." He says, "You know, we all like to come up here and party and so forth, and the House is going to be working every day, and they're going to be having a lot of debate and deliberation, and we're working on the election code. We ain't got nothing to do. It won't take us 3 days to perfect this thing, but we've got to extend it out as long as they are. So what we're going to do, we're going to come in, we're going to be a little slow opening up, and try to get a long prayer and go into session, and then finally get around to calling the issue in hand, the election code. And I want y'all to be prepared with a series of amendments. Don't matter whether it passes or don't pass, it won't matter. We'll finally draw it at us all over into You know, he said, we done got the bill drawn. But he says, we've got to look like we're doing something, which means we've got to have a debate. Now, there's several people participated in that by offering anybody that could think of anything to put in, they put in. And one of the regulations was you couldn't hand out literature within 200 feet of a polling place. And I raised with the objection that whoever drew the bill didn't understand all of Georgia, because 200 feet out of the polling place would put us out of town in Enigma. Jimmy Carter's used that many times. And the other thing I done was when they got to the voting the dead, which was the big accusation against Joe Hirsch and them over at Lumpkin County and over in wherever it was, wherever it was over there somewhere.
Lumpkin, Georgia.
It was over around Plains. The charge was that they had voted the dead. So I thought it'd be an interesting discussion to make an argument for the rights of the dead. And it makes more sense than you think. Here was the argument, and it was received in the gist of almost a Demosthenian type debate. Some of them even sided with me. I said, look, what is the most precious thing an American citizen has? It's his right to vote. The right to vote. Maybe it is a more cherished right than property or money or possessions. Anything short of life itself, the right to vote is a sacred trust. Now, in preparation for our demise, we can all draw up will and testament that projects what's to happen with our car, our cattle, our homes, our money, our stock, our wealth. We can take care of all of the great possessions we've accumulated in a lifetime. Why isn't it fair for a reasonable time to allow a man about to be deceased or a woman to by will and testate declare for his family how he'd vote if he were alive for a reasonable period of time? 2 years, and then an amendment come in with 2.5 years be considered just 2 years. I accepted the amendment. So, and of course, it got 8 or 10 votes, you know, but it was all presented. Now, Jimmy, you know, has used that in many different ways,
Yeah.
but that's fine. I'm going to send him a bill one day.
You know, I saw a sermon preached on that subject not long ago on the internet, quoting you and your bill and also your intention. So you should be flattered. It must have been a good idea. Now,
Well, it was a way to, you know, I was, part of my role with Peters Act was to create some frivolity when I could. I'm not sure it served me well over the long run, because I surely didn't look like a dead serious J.B. Fuqua.
yeah. Bobby, your friends at the Russell Library want to know if you remember going to the prom with a book on romance.
Now, how did they know that? I hadn't had a drink of liquor in 15 years. I don't know. Well, I might have. It was sort of hard times. I guess I need to tell the story, since all this will be buried for years anyway. And even if it ain't, I'm not terribly ashamed of it. I'll have to stop short of calling the name of the nice, my date for the prom. It was my junior year.
Did it start with a G?
Might have. There was a man lived out in the country. It was a moonshiner. And he had a stack of girls. One of them was in my room. And she had a little tough time out there. You know, she didn't have maybe she was a little tough for her to have clothes and you know, her hair fixed, and they done the best they could. But I could see beyond all that into a beautiful girl. I knew she was a beautiful girl. And I knew that her daddy would let me. My daddy was J. Alvin Rowan, was well thought of. And he was a little curious about his girl, but I knew that this fellow would let his daughter go with me to the junior senior. I also knew the family and knew that they'd all get together and take some payday feed sacks and things, and they'd sew together a beautiful dress, you know. So I invited her to go to the junior senior with me. Well, I had a first cousin named Wallace Ramesses Rowan, and he had gone into town and he was more adventuresome, mainly because he was a year older than us. And he'd go around town and he would get books, and he'd charge you a nickel to read a chapter. It was one of the earliest enterprises I ever knew. One of the books he got was Erskine Caldwell's God's Little Acre. Now, y'all wouldn't know this, Bob might, but when that book came out, it was considered scandalous, and it was considered banned in the movies. It was, the Christian community went berserk, and honest to goodness, now it wouldn't even get a PG. It'd get just a G or whatever. But anyway, it had a lot of conversation people wasn't used to reading about. And the character in it was a girl named Darling Jill. And the story was just simply that this deeply religious person give an acre of land to God. It was to be sacred. And he dug for gold in the rest of his farm. And where to get out there was gold on God's little acre. So he had moved God's little acre to another one and dig that one. And in the book, it made it so creative, I think, it discussed certain things about the activities of Darling Jill and one of her would-be lovers. Nothing real bad, but it did discuss kissing. And, you know, we didn't know as much as we ought to about that. I mean, it wasn't something you just, you didn't, things was altogether different, you know. And it talked about Darling Jill had, when she kissed the boy, and I don't remember his name, she had bit him on the lip, and George just kind of, he complained about she just gnawed him half to death, And it was the way that Erskine Caldwell wrote it, it was right erogenous. It was entertaining for the day. Wouldn't interest people now. But anyway, I'd gotten that book and had read those chapters at a nickel a chapter from Wallace. And I'd actually got it for Queen Yola to read. So she had read that, and the chapter I paid a nickel for her to read, I can't remember the girl's name. But she had read that chapter on Darling Jill kissing. So we went to the junior senior. Daddy had an old Plymouth truck. And it wasn't always reliable to crank, but it was easy to push off. It was a straight shift. And my lady friend was real strong, stronger than me. And she also, raised in the family, used to pushing off their old truck. So we decided to risk it, and we went out to Uncle Ralph's tobacco barn, which was on a perfect hill. It was up on a hill, and either way you went downhill. So we went around there and parked on that hill. As we rode out there, that back then, young people went out and parked and might have smooshed a little, whatever. And we was on top of that hill, and my friend was a little buck-toothed. And whenever we pulled up there and parked, on the way out there about a mile from the schoolhouse, I was thinking about the same thing that she was thinking about, and that was reading about Darling Jill kissing. And so when we got that thing put in a safe gear so it wouldn't roll off, and got it started, and I turned towards her, she turned towards me. We both was too anxious. and she just plowed into me and busted my lip with her buck teeth and grabbed the hood and started just about killed me. I wanted to cry right there. But anyway, that I guess is what I was foolish enough to tell somewhere. I don't know.
Well, Bobby, you've been a great public servant. You're well liked and you're well respected. But I would like to ask you a few serious questions now. No frivolity.
Okay.
If you had your career to do over, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I guess anybody that's honest would have to say that you do things a little different if you could figure out a way to either do them better or be more successful in doing them. If I had my career to go over, I think I'd wait another 10 years to run. I think in my case, for my own best interest as a family man, and I got into politics before I really got a stable professional hold on my own professional life, either as a school teacher or farmer or whatever, cattleman, whatever. I give that advice to my son now. Different ones encourage him to run. I said, wait a minute. Wait until you've accomplished the things you want to do professionally. There's always time to run. So if I had it to go over, I would probably wait a few years. I don't regret those early years because, to tell you the truth, that's what made me. I wouldn't have been as successful 10 years later. I'm speaking now of the personal side of what would have been best for me, Bobby Rowan, my family, and I think a later entry would have been better. That's one thing I would have done. I don't regret the stance I took on any issue that I can think of. I pretty much voted without fear. I always learned from Daddy. He told me this the night I got elected. He said, when you go to Atlanta, always slap uphill. Don't never jump on anybody that's in a smaller station of life. If you want to jump on the governor, the head of the highway department, U.S. senator, president, that's all right. Never jump on a project engineer, county commissioner, nobody. Never jump on anybody in a lower station of political life than you. And that's good advice. And I can't remember occasion. He says, help them under you. If you want to attack those above you, that's all right. And I think that's good advice. The other thing is, I don't think I ever got real angry, and I don't know if nothing I'd change about that. When I lost, I wasn't angry. When I won, I really did feel, lucky. I don't really think I accomplished much by standards of other people that have, went to Atlanta, went to Washington, became great in many ways. I guess you couldn't say, I couldn't say, and I don't desire to say that I accomplished a lot. But I tell you what, if you could have told me growing up, as I came up, going through, being inspired, first being a state 4-H club officer, first learning to lose my fear of speaking by W.R. Ty, our county agent, getting me to be in public speaking. Those were monumental changes in my life. If you could have told me along that time that I would one day be a state senator, represent 100,000 people, I would have been real proud. If you could have told me I might have gone on and ran statewide, got elected and served on the Public Service Commission, which nobody knows much what it is, what it does. If they did find out what it done, Bob, they'd beat everybody every race, because but it was good for me. I did run statewide. I did win statewide. Anybody told me growing up I'd run it 18 times and win 16 of those races where the people in the voting jurisdiction had declared me to be the best of the choices, I'd have been real happy. So now that I'm where I am, I'm still real happy. It was as good as I could do. And I done it pretty much my way. I was never tempted to be dishonest. Didn't want to be dishonest. I'm proud of that too, because politics, whether you're from Enigma or Atlanta, don't make a crook out of anybody, but it gives people that are crooks a bigger opportunity. But I went through public life without anybody coming over and trying to bribe me or do anything. And now, it wouldn't have been as successful as they had. So all in all, Bob, I guess I could say that I don't know what I'd have done much different, because just doing the best I could.
What was your most pleasant moment in politics?
Well, this is going to sound this is not going to sound right, but it's true, so I'm going to say it. You see, a politician, most people would think his greatest moment is the great awards. And you could go look on the wall, and I've got a few things hanging up. Go out in the pack house, and I've got about 100 other things where I've been declared everything from Man of the Year to the greatest person living to all these things. I appreciated all of them, and at the time, they were important to me. But I tell you, the greatest reward I ever got is a award that nobody's ever mentioned to me to this day. I never got a vote for it. I never was accoladed for having made a difference. But I made a big difference on something, and it went totally unnoticed. It was the beginning of funding for the WIC program. Now, what the hell would anybody think a South Georgia redneck populace would be all carried away about the WIC program? That's the Women's, Infant, and Children program for giving them nutrition and medical care. You see, I learned something that impressed me. The first 3 months of a pregnancy is crucial. The last 3 months is not. It's as crucial. But the WIC program gives nutrition to unwed mothers or even wed mothers that didn't have resources. Milk, health care, doctor visit, and things. And one day, there was a lady in this town that had was pregnant, and she had a little boy. And after I was no longer in politics, was sitting on the front porch of that house. She had thanked me for getting her the WIC program. She had the little boy, and he was about 6 or 7 years old. And I was on the front porch of that house down there, facing the road. I don't know why I was out there. But I knew that little boy because his mother had obviously shared great affection for me, because she'd tell other people, he got me that WIC program. She had 2 or 3 more children, still got the WIC program. And that little boy rode by on a little wore-out bicycle that had, he didn't know about it, but I associated with him with the difference it might have made. And he got in front of the house, he quit pedaling and held up his hand, and I waved back at him. His mother had told her about me. Nobody else knew anything about that. But I felt good about that. I felt good because I'd done it. I'm not noble, never thought I was, never planned to be. And I certainly am not capable of making good judgments all the time. But that was, I don't think that's the moment people would think touched me as an individual, but it did.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, Bob, I think when it comes to being remembered, you really shouldn't request much. I'd like to be remembered in the minds of everybody that knew me as just like I was. I have no problem with those that didn't like me remembering that they didn't like me. I trust those that did like me will remember me. I think there's a finality to death, and I think you should not burden those people that have been so close to you as family or friends with any further to do about you or your legacy. We're here, we do these things. I'd like to be remembered in the minds of everybody just like they remember me. No more, no less. There was some of them wanted to name a road about me, and I said, I don't want no road. Hell, what am I going to do when it gets potholes in it? You know, why do I want a road? Why do I want a road that's going to be poorly paved, and maybe I won't live. Maybe I'll live long enough to see the potholes in it. This community done something I'm proud of. Nobody knows about it. It doesn't bother me at all. But it was my neighbors and friends. After all, you see, I never acted like a senator or a public service commissioner here. I want to be just, I went to church, to the funeral. I never joined the country club because they'd let me in that I was something else. That wasn't interesting to me. I never really wanted a road named after me. But about 4 years ago, somebody said one night at a council meeting, Bobby Rowan's been here all these years. He's paved all of our roads when he was a senator. He's just been one of us. And we're on the map because Bobby Rowan, keep talking about Bobby Rowan from Enigma. So they built a monument to me. It's downtown. And it's, it's not the monument. It's that a few people would give of their money, put up a small little thing that goes almost unnoticed, never dedicated, never done anything, doesn't have to be. It's made about a 4-foot square. They brought in some stone. It's got one of these historical marker brass plates designating where I kicked off my race for governor of the state in 1974. And it's a nice little thing on Main Street. And that was pleasant,
Bobby, thank you very much.
Well, I've enjoyed y'all. You know that. You can tell. Thank y'all for coming. I don't know where this goes, but at least it's out there.
Well, it will be viewed, I promise you.